It's intimate. It's reserved just for your special someone who
Hmm.
you're married to for the rest of your life. Like,
Right.
why not engage in language that's just reserved for the two of you,
Hmm.
right?
Absolutely.
Welcome to the Get Your Marriage On podcast. I'm your host, Dan Purcell, a Christian marriage and intimacy expert and coach. I'm on a mission to help couples have the best sex and most emotionally intimate marriages possible. Our episodes cover topics you've always wondered about and are packed with practical advice designed to help you take your marriage to the next level. Let's get one thing out of the way right up front. Dirty talk isn't dirty. It's actually an intimate form of communication to let your spouse into your heart and mind. It's a way to express the erotic part of you with your lover. It's about using your words to arouse. The nice thing about married sex is that it's a place you can go where things don't always have to be so cleaned up. You don't have to be so buttoned up. You can be less formal with each other and use language with each other you wouldn't use in any other context, creating more arousal, intimacy, and excitement. If dirty talk, and I put that in air quotes, is something you've always found awkward or have no idea where to start, you're in for a treat. We recorded this podcast a long time ago, and because we have so many new listeners on this podcast now, you may have not heard this episode. So I want to give you a chance to listen to it. I've gone back to the archives so that I can share it with you today. This episode with Melanie Studley from the Anatomy of Us podcast will hopefully help you and your lover discover a new way to draw closer together and have some sexy fun. If you like this episode, you'll definitely like our upcoming virtual retreat all about improving sex in your marriage this July. For this retreat, you and your spouse are going to get a hotel room, Airbnb, or send the kids to grandma's house so you have the house all to yourselves. And you'll join my wife and I live Friday night, Saturday morning, and Saturday night in 3 sessions. We'll give you specific fun and sexy homework to try. The goal of this retreat is to explore sexuality in your marriage at a deeper level than you ever have. You'll walk away with new techniques, confidence, and learn new things about each other and more at an intimate level. Again, the dates are July 12th to 13, and those details are on our website. And let's also not forget our next in-person retreat in sunny St. George, Utah this October. This is what one past participant said about the retreat. She said, "The marriage and intimacy retreat was a life-changing experience for us. After 20 years of marriage, we wanted to take our marriage from good to great. During the weekend, we gained so many incredible insights on how we were constantly trying to fix each other rather than ourselves, making assumptions and putting expectations on each other that were false due to a lack of honest communication that had been shaped over the past decades of routine. We gained so many tools for improving connection and communication, but also changing our own attitudes about ourselves and our intimate life. What an incredible kickstart to the next phase of our marriage, and we can't wait to get started." Close quote. These retreats are fun, romantic, deep, and instructive. We combine instruction and coaching into a powerful weekend. Your marriage deserves the very best investment of your time, talents, and energy. So, come vacation with us. It's limited to just 20 couples, so act now. I love hearing your podcast reviews. If you hear your Apple Podcast review read on the air on this podcast, email me at support@getyourmarriageon.com. And if you haven't left a review yet, do it now, and you might get a gift shipped to you. Here's what this one person said. "Love the down-to-earth, honest, and Christ-centered conversations and advice on this podcast. The Intimately Us app is a must-get, too, if you're married. Thank you, nerdy scholar. You definitely know what's right." If you learned something new in this episode, shoot me an email. I'd love to hear what you think. And now for the episode. Hey, Melanie, it's so good to have you back on the podcast. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It is always a blast to chat with you, always.
Yes. So, kind of for our audience to get to know you a little better and to kind of break the ice. And this is a sex podcast. Let's have some fun here. I
Hmm.
want to hear the story about when you and Seth walked into the sex toy shop in Hawaii.
Okay, so I've got to set the scene. We were in Maui recording a podcast for Jeff and Alyssa Bethke. They have a marriage podcast called, I think it was called Anything and Everything at the time. And so we had already been married, I don't know, 13, 14 years at the time. Never gone into a sex shop ever, never, ever, ever. Never would have thought about it. And there was one in this like little area in Maui. And I was like, okay, there's no kids with us. This is a unique opportunity. Maybe we
No
could
one will
just
see
go
us walk in.
no, yeah, no one, our neighbors aren't gonna see us. No one will see us. So I'm like, let's just give it a go and see what happens. And I said it to Seth, and I mean, I think his jaw hit the floor, right? And he looks
Uh-huh.
at me and he's like, okay. And so we turned to go into the sex shop and it was closed. So we never even went.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah. So we still haven't gone to this day.
But the reaction,
It was good. I would have gone in had it been open, but it wasn't.
that was good. That's great. Today we get to talk about using our language to arouse, aka
Mhm.
dirty talk. And this is prompted selfishly a little bit because I am awful and awkward at it. And I'm not alone because I get Instagram messages and whatever. Like I got this one from a wife that said, "Hey, my husband really wants me to talk dirty to him, but I have no clue where to start. We are nervous and I feel embarrassed and awkward about it. Can
Mhm.
you help us? Can you help me?" And I'm like, that sounds like a great topic for a podcast episode, and I know just the person to call. So,
Yeah, and we get the same questions as well. Like people are like, "This is a thing I know my spouse likes. I don't know
mhm.
how to do it. What do I do?" So I'm glad we're talking about it too.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So first of all, let's set some definitions here. What is quote unquote dirty talk?
Ah, I know that it's such a bad name and I wish it didn't exist, but dirty talk is essentially like talking during intimacy that enhances the experience, right? And what
Uh-huh.
I think is so unfortunate about it, what we talked a little bit about before we started recording, is this idea that in the title of it is dirty, right? The descriptor of it is negative. That's a very negative vibe, right? I
Yes.
think especially for women, you don't want to be seen as dirty. Like that's a not good thing. But really all it is using language, using words to help sort of ignite more passion, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So dirty talk really isn't dirty.
No. No, it doesn't
No,
have to
it's
be. And that's yeah, I think that's where people get really tripped up is that people are like, I want to do this thing. It's dirty, but I'm not necessarily dirty. Like I'm going to use the word like perverted. I say perverted all the time because I think it's kind of funny. But like
uh-huh.
I'm not a perv, so I'm not going to
Yes,
say pervy stuff. So the name dirty talk is immediately just like it's almost like it puts up these walls of barriers of like I can't do that. I don't know how. That's not even in my nature. So what am I supposed to do? So I know you mentioned trying to find a new name for it, so I
yeah.
have the perfect name for it.
All
And
right.
it
What
and
is
this
the
is gonna
new name?
go like this is gonna go with my longer version of what I truly think it should be and how
Uh-huh.
it should be done, so it all ties in, but it's not dirty talk, it's sexy stories. Is that
Sexy
not
stories.
much better and more
That's
inviting?
much better. It even alliterates.
Right, I know. I was all jazzed when I thought of it. But I think that, like, sexy stories changes what it is because really, that's kind of what people are trying to get at with dirty talk, but it's a sexy story feels so much different and so much more, like, doable, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's intimate. It's reserved just for your special someone who
Mhm.
you're married to for the rest of your life. Like,
Right.
why not engage in language that's just reserved for the 2 of you,
Mhm.
right?
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. I agree.
Yeah. So, why is it so awkward to engage in sexy stories?
I think because we have this idea of that the like old model of dirty talk is so ingrained in our heads and I think we have to unlearn what we believe that means. And I think
Mhm.
so many people believe that dirty talk is like so I'm going to kind of use the analogy of like the arousal cycle. So if you're talking about dirty talk in air quotes, it
Uh-huh.
seems like the most explicit like it's the nasty nitty-gritty right away. And so
Yeah,
talking about that when you're not even doing it or ready to do it like that I think is what people have in their minds of like,
because it
it's go
feels out of context.
yes, it feels very out of context. It's like, here we are, we're maybe we're just getting into bed and so it says, "Talk dirty to me," and you're like, "Oh my gosh, like, what does that even mean? Do I have to talk about, like, doing an act to you or whatever?" And so I think it goes from, like, 0 to 5,000, and that I think that's what makes it so challenging for people. But if we put it
Yes.
in the context of, like, a sexy story, which I'll talk about later, it's so, 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 so different, and it's manageable, and it's, like, bite sizes that get to the main course, for lack of a better word.
Gotcha. So if you're awkward about it, don't think I have to get to like level 5,000 right off the bat. Like
Yes.
you can ease your way into this.
Uh-huh.
So
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
cool, cool. Before we move on, I want to know what are the benefits of sexy
Oh, yeah.
stories, arousing language? Because some some of our listeners will like, yeah, yeah, that's all fine, but why?
I've listened to so many podcasts and read so many books that talk about the benefit, and this is going to sound weird for just a second, the benefit of reading versus watching something. Now, why I'm saying that is if we're doing sexy stories with our partner, right, formerly known as dirty talk, we
Uh-huh.
are actually engaging more of our brain than if now I'm not saying that this is something you should do, but we're engaging more of our brain than if we even just watched pornography, right? Because we're
Yes.
when
Uh-huh.
you're listening to someone talk or you're reading a book or whatever,
You're only
your
consuming.
yes, but your visual actually, the visual part of your brain is creating. So it's a much more embodied experience than simply looking at something or like watching something because you're creating it in your head. And so what I love about the idea of sexy stories is it's an embodied experience versus I'm simply watching this thing or it's like the script that my spouse says to me. It's this like whole body thing. And if you're the partner who's creating the journey or the story, or you and your partner are co-creating it, it's even that much more involved and embodied. So I think that that's why it's such an amazing element to add into an intimate experience, but again, we have such poor names for it and then zero guide on how to do it.
Right, right. Okay, so let's go back to that scene. You and your spouse are in the bed, and they say, "Hey, will you talk dirty to me?" or
Mhm.
whatever. Like,
Right. Tell
and
me a
you're like,
sexy
so instead of
story.
freaking out,
Mhm.
what's the practical like first step you can take towards becoming more comfortable with
Right.
the whole idea?
So if you're brand spanking new to this concept, I think the best thing to do would be to prepare yourself ahead of time by having like and this is what I so there's a couple ways of approaching this. I'm gonna do the, like, total newbie and then the, like, maybe I have some experience, but I wanna up my game. So if you're a total newbie, I
Uh-huh.
would pick f and this is something you do alone, you don't do this with your spouse, but you pick something that you are comfortable number 1, sharing. Number 2, that actually turns you on as well. And then
Okay.
number 3, that you know how to communicate. So let me give I'm just gonna, like, lay it
A
out for
few
you and
examples. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, I'm gonna give you examples because I think that's the best way to do it. So for me, if you've heard any of my my former episodes recently on Anatomy of Sex, I did a solo episode about women's arousal.
Mhm.
And one of the things I'm just gonna go here because it works for sexy stories. I absolutely loved the movie. What was it called? It was the most recent one with Channing
Channing.
Tatum. It was called The Lost City. The
Okay.
Lost City.
Uh-huh.
Okay. It's like an
I haven't
action
seen that one
adventure.
yet.
It's got like
Uh-huh.
Indiana Jones vibes, but
Uh-huh.
it's super, super good. But they go to like a jungle, like a secluded jungle. And in one scene, they're dancing at night in this like pavilion and it looks like Mexico, right? And so if I were to tell a sexy story, that's where I would place. So that's my set. So here's the rules for sexy story. You have to have a set and you have to
Uh-huh.
use the senses. Okay. So it's all
Okay.
S words. So sexy stories need set and senses. So
Uh-huh.
that's my setting. So again, right away, I'm telling you this because if I know that that setting is sensual to me, I'm
Uh-huh.
that much more aroused when I share it. I'm that much more into it when I share it, and it's gonna be that much more easier. Like I'm not gonna set my setting in a strip club because I'm not comfortable there, but I am comfortable like on a patio in Mexico with string lights and like tropical breezes and a dress like that I can get into. So that's the first thing. You're going to pick a setting that works for you that actually turns you on and that you know you could share about, right?
Uh-huh.
So that's number 1. Then you're just setting the stage. So use the senses. So we have the 5 senses, right? Sight, sound, smell, taste and touch. So if
Mhm.
I'm in a pavilion in Mexico, it's nighttime, there's candles, there's whatever, what do I see? I see string lights, I see like maybe it's a little bit sweaty and I like it's hot out and maybe
Uh-huh.
my partner is like tiny bit of sweat. It's like you're just setting you're saying what you see and that's going to when you share this with your partner help ignite their visual cortex, right? Even though they're not looking at it, they're imagining it. So you're
Mhm.
putting them into that setting that already kind of gets you fired up. And then they're seeing it too. So you got to explain like, is there a table there? Is it like a cobblestone, whatever? The next one is sound. What do you hear? So in the movie, there's musicians playing like a guitar and I think a lady singing. And so what sounds do you hear? Do you hear like the street noise in the background? Do you hear like, are they shutting the shop up and you hear the sounds of it closing? Do you hear the ocean, right? So you're doing what you see, what you hear, and then the next one is what you smell. Are there
Uh-huh.
flowers blooming? Like we were just in California like last week and there's beautiful honeysuckles growing everywhere in California. I didn't know that. And it was just like this wafting sweet smells would just sort of roll past you while you're walking down the street. So what are you smelling? Is there a bakery nearby? Is it the smell of your partner? Is it the like that musky, like super great? I mean, assuming you're my husband is musky, maybe I smell flowery or whatever. But explain what you're smelling, and that's a huge sensual element. And then taste. Are you eating something? Are you kissing? What does the kiss taste like? What does their skin taste like? If it's hot and you're in Mexico and you're sweating, is it salty? Like it's the expression and the sharing of all of those senses. And then you get into touch, right? So what are you touching? Right?
Uh-huh.
Is it your partner's back? Is it their waist? Is it their arm? Do they have a flower that they're giving to you? Is it the fabric of their shirt or the nape of their neck? Like, so that to me is, if you're a total newbie and you've never done this before, find a set like place that you want to share. Think of all of the sensory things. What are you seeing, smelling, tasting, touching, hearing, all of that? And then go into the story side of it, right? So I really highly encourage you, again, if you've never done this before, do sort of like a practice run in your mind. It doesn't have to be crazy. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to like do anything about it. Just practice it in your mind so that when you go to speak it, you're not like, oh, I've never said these out loud. I've never thought about it. I don't even know. Like, you give yourself a little test run to get used to what that's like. And
Uh-huh.
then I guess essentially, if you're already a little bit experienced with sexy stories, then you can up your game from there. Just add more detail and all of that. But that's where I would
Got it.
start.
Got it. Got it. So when you're driving alone in the car at a red light, you're like, this is a great opportunity to practice
Yes. And you
saying
can,
this out loud. Uh-huh.
yes, you could even record it like on your phone if you needed to hear yourself saying it, if that helps you to like actually say it out loud, or you can just
Uh-huh.
say it to the dashboard, whatever. But
Uh-huh.
practicing it once is going to go a really long way for it feeling less awkward and uncomfortable. And I do wanna, like, say that the pre-thinking through, like, if you're someone that you're like, "Okay, I schedule sex every Wednesday, my husband and I are intimate," whatever, like, if that's something that you do, this
Uh-huh.
practice will help get you in the mood before you're even with your husband or
Oh,
whatever,
right.
right, your
Uh-huh.
spouse. So it's a total, like,
It's a helpful
pre
tool.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's pre-game something.
Pre-game workout.
Yeah.
Sure. Oh, good, good. So why is delivery so important?
Mm,
Like, so you can go on Amazon and there's thousands of books, I'm sure, on
mhm,
how to talk dirty or whatever. And they'll give you a bunch of phrases. And so you memorize it. Like,
mhm.
why is delivery more like important? It's
The
not just
delivery
memorizing things.
yeah, yeah, yeah. The delivery is the you part of it. It's you. And so oftentimes it'll be like, you'll get questions from listeners or whatever. It's like, how do I talk dirty? Like, do I need to sound like someone else? And there's
Uh
all
huh.
these preconceived ideas of like, do I need to sound like I'm a stranger? Do I need to talk weird, like husky and
Uh huh.
raspy or whatever? And
Uh
no,
huh.
you don't need to do any of that. Like, that's just something that maybe you've seen on TV, or it just was a thought you had in your head. But really, this is about you and your spouse enhancing what you already have together. And so the way that I look at the delivery aspect of it is that it's you enhanced. It's not, none of it is fake, none of it is forced, unless that's what you're after. Now, some people could do sexy stories and wanna sound like they're French or wanna sound like they're from Iceland. I don't know. I
Uh
have no
huh.
idea. How do you even sound like they're from Iceland? I don't even know. Like some
With an Icelandic accent, of
right,
course.
right, of course. So there may be people who want to do that, and that's wonderful, but it is not a requirement that the delivery be this sort of like affected different thing. It doesn't need to be set apart. It can just be you sharing a sexy story in a really like inviting way, you know?
And I like what you're saying because you're saying you need to fit it into your personality. You're not trying to like become someone else or take
Mhm.
on a different persona.
Mhm.
You're being you. Like if you're trying to pretend like something else, of course it's going to be awkward. It's going to be weird.
Mhm,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely, and it's just really unnecessary. It's not a requirement at all, and so again, I think it goes back to a lot of unlearning. We need to unlearn and really ask ourselves, "What do I think sexy stories and dirty talk actually is? What do I think it is?" Because it's gonna be different for everybody, and then
Uh-huh.
ask yourself, "What do I not like about that? So what can I take out?" So if I feel like I have to speak like I'm French, let's remove that, and let's
Yeah.
start somewhere new, you know?
Uh-huh.
So you're
And you can
allowed to
work on your French later if
yeah,
you
you can
want
yeah.
to,
Yep,
but you don't have to. Uh-huh.
yes, and I would rather have you have success in, like, incremental stages than try to dive in sounding like you're from Paris and then it flops, you know?
Uh-huh. Right, right. And then you feel awkward, whatever.
Yes.
And I think in practice, this is just my experience. The attempt, like you going to the sex toy store with your
Yeah.
husband, matters far more than actually like succeeding in getting in. Just the willingness to try and engage is has so much mileage. We forget about that.
Absolutely.
Chances are your spouse isn't going to critique you, like,
Right, right, right.
right?
And I think
Or
too, like, it's
uh
like learning to ride a bike, right? At some
mhm,
point, you can ride it with your eyes closed. It's the easiest thing ever. But for the first however many times you tried, you were clumsy at it. So allow that space where it's gonna be, like, a little bit clunky at first, and it's no big deal.
uh-huh. So we talked about sexy stories where you're kind of painting a picture. There's also a bunch of arousing language where it's more of like saying like in other words like, "Hey, I'm really into you," or I really want you to do me right now," or
Mhm,
like
mhm.
other things like that too. Can you talk on that a little bit? These are more like the one-liners, the more
Almost like
those kinds of
directions.
things.
Right,
Uh-huh.
statements or directions. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that, as you were saying that made me think of is there is definitely a place for asking questions within the realm of sexy stories. Then this is almost like a different side of it. So let me kind of explain what I mean. So it like we talked about earlier, like telling a sexy story, you're setting the place, the setting, the sights, sounds, smells, blah, 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 all that stuff. But then kind
Uh-huh.
of on the flip side, without a story, you're just doing
Uh,
like sexy talk to one another. Um,
yes.
you are welcome. This works really well if you're not sure what your spouse actually thinks about something. Don't assume they like what you like. And I'm not saying that in a mean way. It's more of an invitation of ask and say, "Hey, do you like it? Like, would you like it if I did X, Y, and Z?" Like asking a question. And here's why it's important. They may not like it. You
I
can
see.
say, "Hey, would you like it if I don't know, sucked on your toe?" And they might be
Uh-huh.
like, "No, please never do that." Right? And so
Uh-huh.
then you've
Right.
you've spared yourself embarrassment of like not just going in for the kill, right? So there
Uh-huh.
is, but also it is a safe way to approach a new idea without it being scary or weird or as vulnerable. So I will say that that's a great way to like get into if you're new to the idea of talking about directives or sharing like, "Hey, I like it when you do X, Y, and Z thing." You can ask it in a question instead of just like, "This is a thing I'm sure you like. Let's do this." Like that might not be great, you know? And there also is too, like, knowing the nature of your spouse. So some spouses would really like to be told what to do or like have that sort of more an aggressor, aggressive, like even if it's something that they're not sure they'll like, they might enjoy the sort of like feistiness of being told. But not everyone's like, "I'm not like that. You are not gonna tell me what you're gonna do to me." Like, "No,
Uh-huh.
thanks. We're gonna have a conversation about it." And that to me is sexy to ask me if I like it, ask me if I
Uh-huh.
wanna do it, and if I say no, don't you dare make me. But not everyone is like that. So kinda like knowing the nature of your spouse, knowing the nature of yourself, and then being able to kind of put that into practice with statements like, "I like it when you dot, dot, dot," right? Or
Mhm.
another thing too is that's another great way that I like it when you is another great way to share with your spouse things you would like them to do more of without demanding it. You're just
Yes.
saying, "I like it when you do that thing to me." And then they'll know, "Oh, I should do that thing more." Right? So it's really inviting as opposed to, "Why don't you ever do that thing to me?" Right?
Right,
So there's lots of ways
right.
to incorporate the like request comment stuff in there without it feeling so scary, I guess.
Another thing that's the benefit, like what you just mentioned too, is this is also a safe place to give your spouse something in fantasy that you're
Mhm.
not willing to give in real life. For
Absolutely.
instance, there's some sexual acts that we don't do with my wife and I together because of just
Reasons.
preferences, yeah,
Right.
comfort level, whatever. But we can give it to each other in fantasy,
Mhm.
meaning sometimes even during the act of sex, we'll be making up a sexy story together. It's like it feels like improv sometimes, but like she's telling the story or I'm telling the story, and it's incorporating these very erotic
Mhm.
themes
Mhm.
between us that we know we'll never act out in real life.
Right.
But for that moment, it's we're like it really activates a part of your mind that's very erotic, and
Yeah.
it's a big turn on.
Right, that's
Like,
beautiful.
I don't think my wife and I will ever desire to have sex in a public park
Right.
ever, like to actually do that. or on a roof of a house. I'm just
Mhm.
making up something kind of bizarre. Not that these are my actual fantasies, but if that was my actual fantasy, because that's my friend's fantasy,
Mhm.
that we could actually like engage this in more using our language
Mhm.
as a way to kind of
Yeah.
set that scene and whatever. So,
Absolutely. And there's so much to say about that because our brains don't know the difference from what our imagination is telling us. I mean, think about watching a movie. You're watching a movie, like let's say you go and see the new like a Thor
Spider-Man or
movie or
whatever.
whatever. Yeah,
Right.
Spider-Man. And you're like, oh my God, your whole body is responding to this thing that you're seeing with your eyes, which is not happening to you, but you're scared too, because what if the building hits the car? Blah, right? So our
Right.
brains actually don't know the difference between what's imagined and what's real. And so what's so cool, and we all know this to be true because we felt it before. So it is really amazing to use that to our advantage where I mean, I will just share this is explicit, but whatever. Like the idea of multiple partners. Well, what if I could multiply my husband? Right? What if I had 2 of
Uh-huh.
my husband? Like, that's a cool thought sometimes,
That
and
yeah.
that's a fantasy that we can talk about that of course, that's not gonna happen. Like, that would never
Uh-huh.
wouldn't even be able to happen,
But you can
but
explore it in fantasy.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, and it will engage all of the same body systems, like, it will ignite everything inside of you, and so it's such an amazing like safe, loving way to really deeply dive into intimacy in a new way with your partner. And it's really, there's a lot of growth and trust that is built in that when you do this stuff like respectfully and safely and in a loving way, I think, you know?
Yeah. That's right. So another thing about dirty talk I've learned, it doesn't always have to be degrading
Oh,
because you
yeah.
probably read or hear about things like some of it's kind of degrading.
Right.
If that's
Yeah.
if you get turned on by that, by all means, because a
Hmm.
lot of people do. There's something sexy about the naughty and the
Hmm.
forbidden, and but if that's not you, you don't have to engage in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it's important to understand number one, yes, many people actually do really enjoy that degrading whatever, and that's fine,
Uh-huh.
no big deal. But I
Mhm.
do encourage people to step beyond and see, like, actually, what would it look like if I pushed into really romantic intimacy and sexy story, like super romantic. What would that look like? That would be different. That's not something I know. That's not something I've seen in pornography or whatever. So I don't even know how to do that. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist though. And it doesn't mean that it wouldn't be amazing. Right? So like even expanding what you see as being arousing, right? So for example, yeah, we kind of all go to like the baseline thing of like the most dirty, the fastest, you know? But what
Mhm.
would it look like if we expanded that out to, and feel free to come up with ideas too. Like I think this is a kind of a cool concept that I don't hear almost anything about but like expanding what is arousing or like arousal inducing. And for me, it's like food, travel, and novel things like skydiving or rock climbing. Like, so what if I tried to incorporate into my sexy story these things
Uh-huh.
that I want to do? Like, I'm excited about these things anyway. I like rock climbing, I like swimming and in the ocean. Like, incorporate that into your whole story, and then you don't just have, like, a tiny narrow thing that you can go to, you have, like, the world of possibilities for sexy stories instead of just, "And then we were in the nasty bathroom, and we were boning," you know? There's more to it than that.
Oh, that's so funny. We were in the nasty bathroom, and it was so cramped, and there's trash everywhere.
I know. It's, like, the grossest scenario I
I
can think
know.
of. I don't know.
It's like, "Ugh, this is not a
Oh,
turn on."
yeah.
And the flight attendant keeps banging on the door.
"Listen, sir, we're gonna land soon."
Yeah, don't go there.
Right.
Alright. So part of arousing language and sexy stories is using different words for different
Mhm.
things. And this is something very intimate, right? These are
Mhm.
words that you only use with your spouse or something like that. Can you talk on that a little bit? Maybe
Yeah.
like how to come up with words for each other, words for
Mhm.
body parts, for different
Mhm.
sex acts and things like that?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple ways of looking at this, and one would be that culturally it's different from different places in the world. Like there is different slang, and I
Uh-huh.
want to start with slang as like I'm guessing most people are going to use slang as the foundation of these words that they will use in their sexy stories,
Uh-huh.
because medical terminology sounds weird.
Uh-huh.
That just sounds too clinical unless you're
Yep.
into it.
Right.
Um, which
Unless it's
whatever, right?
it's the
Yeah.
doctor's office now.
That's really funny. But so I will say the one thing to, and this isn't, I don't mean like look out for it like it's bad, something bad's gonna happen, but just be aware that between genders, some terms might feel degrading while others feel exciting. And you can
Mhm.
figure that out again in conversation, in intimacy. You can ask, hey, do you like it if I call this thing a vet? And your
Uh-huh.
partner may be like, "Oh, yeah, I totally love that." Or they might be like, You know, not super into that." And you can write
Uh-huh.
it down. I know that there are, like, the apps and things like
Like,
that
the
where you can.
Intimately Us app has a part
Yes.
for this
Yes.
very thing. Uh-huh.
I think it's so brilliant. So, like in Intimately Us, it goes through all the things like what do you want to call your breasts and your whatever, like all the things.
Right, your
Because
penis and
yeah,
yeah, uh-huh.
so having the slang that your partner feels comfortable with is
Mhm.
helpful. Also, though, learning new slang on purpose for the purpose of enhancing your intimate moments is also fun. So look
That's
through
really
those
hot.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And you're like, oh, I've never said that word before, or I didn't know that had a name.
Uh-huh.
Like, so I think incorporating language, like what we call things and acts, even bringing in new words and language and stuff like that, and finding like a good unifying ground there is super super fun and helpful.
'Cause you'd hate to, like, in the height of the moment, like, blurt out that word you
Right.
think is so arousing, and then it's, like, totally it's like a bucket of cold water on the other person. That
And
would
that can happen.
not go
Yeah,
well.
that can happen. So again, you can do it in the asking format. Do you like it when I call this thing a
Mhm.
vet?
Right,
And
right.
but I will say too, if your spouse says a word that you're not used to hearing, I would say
Uh-huh.
stay open-minded. Don't immediately like that has happened where I'm like, "Oh my gosh, my husband says that?" Like I've
Uh-huh.
that has happened and I've been had like this tiny tiny flicker of like, "Whoa, didn't know that was what he would say." But also then I'm like, "It's not a big deal." Like that's just again, a lot of it is cultural because we're not from the same place. But having an open mind to me like it's actually okay that that's a word he uses. It's not a big deal. But
Gotcha.
again, but it's
Yeah.
also not degrading. It's not like he's calling me something bad. So, it's a totally different that would be different.
Yeah, yeah. Very good. Compliments can be really sexy too.
Oh yeah,
Like, let's say you're
absolutely.
texting back and forth and it's you wanna get it steamy. What are
Mhm.
some things you can do even in that context to
Mhm.
kinda arouse and get things going?
Mhm. I would say one of the best things to do, and this is something that Seth and I talk about a fair bit on our podcast, is like leaning into what the kind of like the core needs of your partner are. Like we all sort of know what, like you hear people talk about men want to be respected, women want to be cared for, right? We know these things. So
Mhm.
what if you like lean into that? You lean into like, wait, what if I could make my husband feel so dang respected right now that it makes him into it? Or what if I
Uh-huh.
could make my wife feel so taken care of right now that all
Uh-huh.
the like I say this to Seth all the time. Like there are certain things like if he takes care of me, he's like, "Yep, I've done the dishes. They're already done. I've started a bath for you and I changed the oil in your car. I love you, sweetheart." I'm immediately like, "Where do you want another kid? I'm here for it." Like it hits all of those areas for me. So yeah,
Uh-huh.
there's definitely a way where we can use like even our masculine and feminine differences and compliments like very pointed and focused and it doesn't take much to really ignite that within your spouse and it's really really fun to do.
That's good. Great. Okay, let's end our interview with a few super practical, like, specifics. We'll keep this all PG-13.
Yeah.
I think some people have never opened a book or never don't watch salacious movies or whatever,
Mhm.
yet they need good resources, so we're going to provide them some,
Mhm.
or you're gonna provide them some, Melanie.
Thanks.
Can you give us a few example phrases that people can, like, hold on to and use?
Let me see. I want to go like I don't want to think of it in phrases 'cause I don't want people to think of like, "Oh, if I don't remember how to say this thing, then I'm gonna fail." I want it to be almost like in acts, like little snippets of acts, right?
Mhm.
So whatever again, this is hard because I'm talking about male and female at the same time, and I'm talking about, obviously
Oh,
it's
okay.
different
Should
what
we
a
pick
man.
one
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
first?
I'll make some scenarios. I mean, it's kind of all
Okay.
the
Yeah,
same,
yeah,
but
yeah.
so I would think of let's make it like a tactical thing. I'm going to use the senses. I'm going to do the sexy story idea and then also like the delivery side of it. So
Okay.
again, if you're wanting to like we talked about earlier, you wanting to create a scenario of something that couldn't actually happen. Like I'm not actually going to have sex on the top of the roof in Dubai, but
Uh-huh.
man, what if I talked about it? right? So
Uh-huh.
you could say to your spouse, again, I'm going to start with a question. What do you think about the idea of us traveling to Dubai and we're wearing like so again, I'm going to use all the senses. That's how I think.
Mhm.
I immediately see in my mind like we have different clothes on. We have like maybe I have on like a long flowing dress and it's really bright and we're on the rooftop, but when we can see the Burj Khalifa and the sand and it's the sun is setting. What would you think if I bent down and started to give you X, Y, and Z?
Uh-huh.
Right? So you're setting a scene, you're creating an act, and then you're
Mhm.
asking your partner, "What do you think about that?" Right?
Gotcha.
So that's a
Uh-huh.
good setup, like a kinda like a softball. You're lobbing it that way, and then if they say, "Yes, I would like that," you continue with your story, right?
Okay,
So you
gotcha.
talk
Uh-huh.
about what does that look like? Okay, so if I'm gonna do that thing that you just said yes to, that means that we're gonna find a seat somewhere on the top of this building, and I'm going to be holding my dress, and you can see my flip-flops or whatever the thing is, right? And we're gonna walk over,
Right.
right? So again, you're setting the scenes and slowly creating what is the act that I'm doing? Maybe it's oral sex. Are there other people around? Is there nobody around? Is it nighttime? Is it daytime? And you're just creating it and then adding as you go, right?
Uh-huh.
So in that one act can move on to another act, right? So maybe it starts with oral sex, but again, think of it in a story. It's like a plot,
Uh-huh.
storyline. And you can make it up as you go, no big deal. But like that one act can turn into something else, right? Maybe it switches
Mhm.
then and he's doing something for her. Or maybe you go from the rooftop to the balcony or the swimming pool or the sand dunes. I don't know. That sounds painful, but that's always an option. Or the back of a car. I don't know.
Uh-huh.
Um, so that is like an act idea that I think helps you understand how you could kind of create that scenario and share it. On the flip side of that, you could also do the like, hey, do you like it when we? Right. So this
Uh-huh.
would be based off of something that you enjoy, but maybe you're embarrassed to share. Right. So this might be something like actually for some women, they actually don't there's a like a myth or a thing floating out there that women don't like like giving men oral sex, and some
Mhm.
women love it. Some women really like it. And
They
so
get
if you're
really turned on by that.
right,
Yeah.
and if
We
you're a
interviewed someone in our podcast just last week about that.
right, if you're a
Mhm.
woman that really likes giving oral sex to your husband, but you're embarrassed by that because society tells you you shouldn't,
Mhm.
you can bring that to your husband and be like, "Hey, do you like it when I do X, Y, and Z?" And he will
Uh-huh.
say, "Yes." And then you might say,
Uh-huh.
"What do you like about it?" And then
Uh-huh.
that's his opportunity to tell you more. "I like it when you do this thing or you nibble here or lick there," whatever the thing is,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Uh-huh.
And then that will enhance and sort of draw out in more detail. Not only are you thinking about it, then y'all can go ahead and do it, right? So
Uh-huh.
that's a way to bring it. I'm trying to think if there's any other scenarios that would be helpful to hear, like, for people who are just sort of stumbling I guess let me do it from a man's perspective, and you can help me with this too, because 'cause I've been speaking a
Yep.
lot from a woman's perspective to her
Uh-huh.
husband. But the other way around, I think of if Seth were to tell me a sexy story, this is just
Mhm.
kind of what I'm thinking right off the bat. I would not want to feel like I had to then go perform that sexy story for him. I would wanna be, like, able to be in the moment and hear it and listen without feeling like I've gotta now do this thing. And so I think that if you're a man talking to your wife, really make sure that it's in almost like in that imaginary realm. Like, can you imagine that we are, in some place or location or we're on vacation or whatever?
Gotcha.
You know what I
We're
mean?
back
And
in the
you're
Middle Ages or
yes, there we
some
go. We're
different context that you don't
yes,
live
totally
in.
different
Uh-huh.
yes.
Right.
And,
Uh-huh.
and then the man would explain, "Can you imagine this thing? And what if I did this to you?" Like, it's a what if, it's not like, "Now we have to." Because I think
Uh-huh.
that for women too can be very, there can be like a guarded feeling of like, "Oh my gosh, I don't wanna do this thing he just talked about." So it's different if he goes, "Can you imagine what that would be like?" Or, "I've sometimes thought about this thing. What do you think about it?" Like, making it a conversation so it feels open and okay and safe. And like at any point I say, I don't like that, it's okay to stop that if we need it to. I don't think we're going to
Mhm.
stop, but making it feel like a conversation can make
Mhm.
it feel safer. What are your thoughts? I don't know. Is there anything that I missed from a guy's perspective, you think?
No, I think that one more thing is just play with masculine and feminine
Hmm.
energies.
Hmm.
And only 80% of men prefer the masculine energy in sex.
Hmm.
20% of men prefer more to be chased and to be submitted to. And
Mhm.
flip side for women too, 80% ish of women like to, be the ones seduced. But
Mhm.
there's a small percentage that like to be more the dominant type,
Mhm.
you know,
Mhm.
quote unquote masculine energy. So I'm not talking about men and women. So play with those masculine and feminine energies. So it's a very
Mhm.
masculine energy to kind of tell the feminine like what you're going to do and like
Mhm.
do this. Like I
Mhm.
remember telling my wife once like, "Hey, flash me." And I
Mhm.
said it in a very authoritative voice,
Mhm.
and it was a turn on for her,
Right.
and
Right.
it was a turn on for me too, what followed. But,
Yeah.
there's you can, do just be a little more step into that dominant role.
Mhm.
Like, sometimes I'll use a line like, "Mrs. Purcell, it's time that I take you to bed." Like, she loves hearing that. It's like
Right. That's brilliant.
because right, it's a good line because it's playing with our masculine, feminine,
Mhm.
roles
Yeah.
in that sexual realm. So,
Yeah.
like, I lean into that and, just exaggerate it just a little bit, I'd say,
Absolutely.
caricaturize it just a little bit.
Yeah.
So it's kind of funny
Mhm.
and it's I don't know, it's playful that way. But in
Right.
the end, I like what we're saying. You have these conversations with your spouse. You can practice alone if you're awkward, but,
Mhm.
start trying to do things, and when your spouse does something that you don't
Mhm.
like, can you be open about it, like what you said, and, just give them gentle feedback, like, "Hey,
Right.
let's do a redo on that, go
Right.
back
Oh,
and,
even better, let
change
me tell
this."
you
Uh-huh,
what you can do
uh-huh.
because this is all imaginary. You can just change the
Yes.
scenario. It's like
Yeah.
choose your own adventure. Nothing's
Uh-huh.
set in stone. So if they
Uh-huh,
say something that you're like, "Ugh, gag me, I'm not
uh-huh.
into that," you can
Right.
literally just and this is I think a much more help. I'm glad that you said that because this is an opportunity where you can just rewrite that part of the story without making
Uh-huh.
them feel bad. Because that's what
Exa
definitely what could happen is that let's say Seth suggests something that I'm like, "That's so gross," or "I would never do that." You don't need to say that. You can be like, "Or what if instead of having sex in the mud, we went to a hotel in Paris and had big, huge windows and coffee?" I don't know. Like, what if we did that instead? Like, not that mud sex is bad. I'm just saying you just rewrite the story and you sweep
Uh-huh.
the energy. And I love that you said masculine and feminine energy. I think the biggest takeaway in all of this is that these sexy stories are all about the energy they create and inspire in each of you. They're all about the energy that is sort of carried forth and brought forth and invoked or whatever from the conversations that you're having. And so don't think too much on is the topic what I want to talk about? Is the act what I want to do? It's what's the energy, right? So let me use
Yes.
a perfect example. This is going to be a really, really random example, but we were just in Venice Beach in California at the skate park. And there's a million skaters, roller skaters, rollerbladers, skateboarders. Some roller skaters, although they're on the same thing as other roller skaters, some of them look like they've roller skated for 9 seconds and they're going to break their wrist. Other roller skaters can dance and go backwards and do spins. And there's the difference is like the energy, their skill level and all that stuff, but the energy feels so different from I'm afraid, I'm gonna fall to I got this. I'm dancing. Look at this move.
Y
Have you seen that? Like so the energy is so different. And so I think a lot of people are worried about the checklist. Like, did I say the right word? Did I talk about the right act? Did I talk about the right location? Don't worry about that as much as the energy that you're bringing, right?
Mhm,
Think of being a magnetic like the story you're sharing, even if it's about a farm in Iowa, could be about anything. It could be
mhm.
milking cows and a farm in Iowa. That's kind of a
Uh-huh.
boring setting, but I guarantee you I could make it sexy because of the energy that I can bring to that. So
Yes.
sexy is not necessarily an externalized thing, it's an energy. It's
It's
an
not a
energy that you
script,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
either.
Mhm.
Yeah. The
So
energy you bring, that's good.
mhm. Yeah, and having an open energy, an excited energy, an inviting and accepting energy is gonna go so much further than just being like, "I'm trying to be sexy right now." Like, that's not a good energy, you know?
No. Uh-uh, uh-uh. This has been so good, so helpful. If people wanna hear more about you and what you do, where do they go?
They can listen to us on the Anatomy of Us podcast. We also have Anatomy of Sex, which is a Patreon show that we do every single Friday. We have a website where we do coaching. So I do coaching we do couples coaching and individual coaching. And it's all just follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Anatomy of Us everywhere. So yeah.
Very good. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me. This has been a blast.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you're interested in accelerating growth in your marriage, either sexually, emotionally, or spiritually, I want to invite you to work with me in my affordable coaching program called Next Level. More information about Next Level and my fun and sexy apps for couples are available at getyourmarriageon.com. Please also don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss a single episode. And be sure to tell your married friends. I promise, they will thank you for life. Now go get your marriage on.